It was a quiet morning when Jake's father, Thomas, decided it was time to take his son to the doctor. Jake had been feeling sick for several days, and his symptoms were getting worse. He had a fever that wouldn't go down, a sore throat that made it difficult to swallow, and his energy had drained away, leaving him lying in bed all day. Thomas, a hard-working man, had never seen his son so weak before, and worry filled his heart. After making the decision to go to the hospital, Thomas bundled Jake up and drove to the well-known clinic in town. The hospital was modern, with bright white walls and large windows that let the sunlight pour in. It had a reputation for having the best doctors, so Thomas was hopeful that they could help Jake feel better. But little did he know, the day would turn out to be much more than just a visit for treatment. As they arrived, Thomas and Jake were greeted by a nurse who guided them through the busy halls to a private examination room. It wasn't long before a tall, middle-aged man in a white coat walked into the room, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson was a well-respected doctor in the area, known for his intelligence and sharp skills. But from the moment he walked in, Thomas could sense something strange about him. Dr. Thompson's smile didn't seem very genuine, and his eyes quickly scanned Jake, before looking away as if he wasn't fully interested. He asked a few questions about Jake's symptoms in a robotic tone, jotting down notes without much care. Thomas didn't think much of it at first. After all, doctors were often busy, and perhaps he was just tired. But as Dr. Thompson continued his examination, things started to feel off. When Thomas mentioned that Jake had been feeling unusually weak for a week, Dr. Thompson seemed uninterested, his eyes quickly flicking back to his clipboard. "You're sure there's nothing else?" Dr. Thompson asked, without looking at Thomas directly. "No other signs of infection? No one else in your family is sick?" He barely gave Thomas a chance to respond before moving on to the next part of the examination. Jake, who had been quietly sitting on the examination table, tried to speak up, but his voice was too weak to get much out. Dr. Thompson didn't seem to notice, or perhaps didn't care. He moved on to other questions about Jake's diet, his school activities, and even his friends. Thomas grew uncomfortable. He could feel the doctor's eyes flicking from him to Jake, his face showing no real emotion. It was as if Dr. Thompson wasn't fully present, like he had already made up his mind about Jake's condition without actually listening. When Dr. Thompson finished his exam, he told Thomas that Jake's fever was nothing serious and might just be a common cold. But when Thomas asked about other potential causes, the doctor shrugged and gave him a quick response. "There's nothing to worry about," Dr. Thompson said, offering no further explanation. But Thomas wasn't convinced. He looked at his son, who was pale and weak, and knew in his gut that something wasn't right. After Dr. Thompson left the room, Thomas sat down beside Jake, feeling uneasy. His instincts told him that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He looked at his son, who seemed so fragile, so unlike the energetic boy he had once known. Jake's eyes were half closed, and he shivered slightly, even though the room was warm. "I'm going to get you better, buddy," Thomas whispered, running a hand through his son's messy hair. The nurse came in shortly after and handed them a prescription for some basic cold medicine. "Dr. Thompson said it's nothing serious," she said cheerfully, as though everything was normal. Thomas didn't feel reassured. He took the prescription but knew deep down that this wasn't just a cold. He had seen Jake go through the regular flu before, and this didn't feel the same. There was something more to it, something that the doctor hadn't even bothered to look into. Determined to find out what was really wrong, Thomas decided to schedule another appointment. But when he called the hospital the next day, something strange happened. The receptionist told him that Dr. Thompson was the only doctor available, but that Jake could be seen by someone else if he preferred. "Why can't I just see another doctor now?" Thomas asked, his voice tightening with frustration. "My son's condition isn't improving." The receptionist hesitated for a moment. "Well, Dr. Thompson is the best we have, sir. He's the most qualified." Thomas didn't know what to make of that. He had been to this hospital before and seen other doctors, all of whom had been kind and thorough. Yet here was Dr. Thompson, who barely seemed to care about his son's health. Thomas tried to shake off his anger, but it gnawed at him. He decided to take Jake to a different doctor in the city, a well-known specialist who had a great reputation. When they arrived at the new clinic, the doctor examined Jake carefully, running several tests and asking more questions. After a thorough checkup, the new doctor revealed that Jake was actually suffering from a viral infection that needed immediate treatment. The doctor prescribed stronger medications and ordered a few follow-up appointments. Why didn't Dr. Thompson catch this? Thomas wondered aloud. He was both relieved and frustrated. How could he miss something so serious? The new doctor assured him that Jake would recover with the proper care, but Thomas couldn't let go of his anger. He kept thinking about how Dr. Thompson had dismissed him so easily, without any real explanation. He had to wonder, was it because of Jake's background? Was that why the doctor hadn't paid attention to the details? The more Thomas thought about it, the more it became clear. Dr. Thompson hadn't just made a mistake, he had ignored his son's needs, possibly because of who they were. And now, Thomas was determined to make sure that this didn't happen to anyone else. Thomas sat in the waiting room of the new doctor's office, trying to keep calm, but his mind was racing. His son, Jake, was resting in the seat beside him, holding a cup of water with shaking hands. Thomas could see how weak he still was, despite the new medicine. The frustration in his chest grew heavier with each passing minute. He couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Thompson. How could a doctor so respected in the community be so careless with his own child's health? Thomas had never been one to back down from a challenge. He was a father who would do anything to protect his family, and the idea that his son had been mistreated stirred a fire inside him. He thought about all the other families who might be going through the same thing. What if Dr. Thompson had ignored other children too? What if his carelessness wasn't just an accident? The thought made Thomas feel sick. On the drive home that day, Thomas' mind kept turning over the events. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like Dr. Thompson's actions had been more than just neglect. There had been an almost cold indifference, a lack of compassion that Thomas had never seen in a doctor before. The way Dr. Thompson had brushed off his concerns without even a second thought, it didn't sit right. "I won't let this go," Thomas muttered to himself as he drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He knew he had to do something about it, but what could he do? He wasn't a lawyer or a medical expert, just a father who had tried to do the right thing for his son. When they got home, Thomas helped Jake to bed. The boy had barely touched his dinner, his face pale and tired. Jake looked up at his father with weak eyes. "I'll be okay, Dad," Jake whispered, trying to smile. Thomas nodded, but inside, he wasn't so sure. He kissed his son on the forehead and sat by the bed for a while, thinking. He couldn't let Dr. Thompson's treatment slide. He had to make sure that the doctor faced consequences for what he had done, not just for Jake, but for everyone who might have been treated the same way. But how? What could he do to get the hospital to listen, to get people to pay attention to what had really happened? Thomas spent the next few days researching. He scoured online reviews of Dr. Thompson, trying to find any hint that he wasn't the only one who had experienced this kind of treatment. He dug through medical records, hoping to find any mistakes or signs of poor judgment that might help his cause. He was determined to find something, anything, that would make people take notice. At night, when Jake was asleep, Thomas would stay up late, reading and writing notes. He was becoming obsessed with the idea of exposing Dr. Thompson for who he truly was. He wouldn't let his son be just another case that was ignored. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be easy. Taking on a respected doctor would be a huge challenge, but Thomas was more than ready for it. His son's health, and the future of others, was on the line. For the next few days, Thomas didn't sleep much. His mind was always working, thinking about how to make things right for Jake and how to stop Dr. Thompson from treating anyone else the way he had treated them. Thomas knew he couldn't just sit back and hope that someone would do something. He needed to act. He began to research everything he could about Dr. Thompson. He started with the doctor's history at the hospital, looking for any signs of complaints or mistakes. It wasn't easy. Dr. Thompson was well respected and had a clean record in most public areas. But Thomas wasn't ready to give up just yet. He spent hours on the internet, reading through medical forums, looking up patient reviews, and even contacting other people who had been treated by the doctor. He hoped to find something that would support his suspicions. Thomas found several mentions of Dr. Thompson in online reviews. Some people praised him, saying he was thorough and knowledgeable, while others gave him poor ratings, saying that he was too quick to dismiss their concerns or not listen to their questions. But nothing concrete stood out. Feeling frustrated, Thomas took the next step. He went to the local library and searched through old newspapers, looking for anything about Dr. Thompson that might be hidden away. After hours of searching, Thomas stumbled upon an article from a few years ago, one that hadn't been widely discussed. It talked about a lawsuit filed by a patient who had claimed that Dr. Thompson had ignored their condition, causing unnecessary pain and suffering. The case had been settled quietly, with no public attention. It was as though someone had tried to cover it up. The discovery sent a chill through Thomas. He wasn't sure if the case had anything to do with the treatment of his son, but it was enough to make him realize that Dr. Thompson's record wasn't as spotless as everyone thought. Now, Thomas had something to work with. He wasn't just going after a doctor for one mistake. He was going after a pattern of carelessness. Thomas knew he couldn't go to the hospital without solid proof. He couldn't just walk in and make accusations based on his feelings. But now he had something concrete to stand on. He decided to contact a lawyer, someone who could help him gather more information and take legal action if necessary. He didn't want to go that route unless he had to, but he needed to make sure the doctor faced the consequences for his actions. As the days passed, Thomas became more and more focused on his plan. He didn't just want to expose Dr. Thompson. He wanted to make sure no other family would have to face the same treatment. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared. No matter what it took, he was going to make things right for Jake. Thomas' determination to find evidence against Dr. Thompson grew stronger with each passing day. He had already contacted a lawyer who agreed to help him if things got serious. But now, Thomas knew he needed more. He needed something that would prove Dr. Thompson's behavior wasn't just a one-time mistake. He needed to show that the doctor had a history of dismissing patients and their concerns. As he continued his research, Thomas found himself going deeper into the hospital's records. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had a sense that something was being hidden. One evening, after a long day at work, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, reviewing a pile of documents he had gathered over the past few weeks. Among them, he found a report about a past medical case involving Dr. Thompson. At first, it seemed like just another routine case, but as Thomas read further, he realized that it wasn't. The case described a situation where a patient had complained about Dr. Thompson's care, claiming that he had failed to take their symptoms seriously. The patient had been suffering from a condition that had gone untreated for weeks, leading to serious health problems. Although the case had been quietly settled out of court, the details suggested that Dr. Thompson had not only ignored the patient's concerns, but had also been less than honest in his reports. Thomas' heart raced as he read on. This wasn't just a one-off mistake. It seemed that Dr. Thompson had a pattern of not listening to patients, particularly when it came to those who were different from the majority. Thomas couldn't believe what he was reading. The doctor had ignored this patient's pleas for help, just like he had done to Jake. The thought made Thomas' blood boil. But it wasn't just the patient's complaints that stood out. As Thomas continued to dig through the records, he found something else, a small detail that had been buried deep within the documents. Dr. Thompson had been investigated a few years ago for similar complaints, but had never faced any consequences. The investigations had been closed with little to no follow-up, and the hospital had quietly swept everything under the rug. It was a disturbing pattern. Complaints about Dr. Thompson had been filed, but they were always ignored or hidden. With this new discovery, Thomas knew he had something important. He wasn't just dealing with a careless doctor. He was dealing with someone who had been allowed to continue his practice despite a history of mistreating patients. This was bigger than just Jake's case. It was about holding Dr. Thompson accountable for his actions and making sure no one else suffered in silence. Thomas took a deep breath. He knew this would be the turning point. He had to expose Dr. Thompson's behavior, and he now had the proof to back it up. But even with this new information, Thomas felt the weight of what was to come. He wasn't sure how far he was willing to go, but he knew that he couldn't stop now. Not when so many others might have been hurt by the same man. The days after Thomas made his discovery were filled with tension. With the new evidence in his hands, he knew it was time to confront Dr. Thompson. He could no longer allow the doctor to get away with what he had done, not just to Jake, but to others as well. But Thomas wasn't sure how to approach it. Should he go to the hospital administrators first? Should he call Dr. Thompson and confront him directly? He debated the options for days, but in the end, he knew there was only one way to get answers. One morning, Thomas decided to take matters into his own hands. He called the hospital and requested an appointment with Dr. Thompson, telling the receptionist that it was urgent. Surprisingly, the hospital agreed to set up a meeting. Thomas had done his homework, and he was ready. When the day of the meeting arrived, Thomas felt a mixture of anxiety and resolve. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to stand up for his son and for all the other patients who had been treated unfairly by Dr. Thompson. As he walked into the office, Dr. Thompson was already sitting behind his desk, flipping through some paperwork. His face was as emotionless as ever, and he barely looked up when Thomas entered the room. "Mr. Thomas," Dr. Thompson said without a hint of warmth, "how can I help you today?" Thomas felt a rush of frustration, but pushed it aside. He needed to stay calm. He placed the stack of documents on Dr. Thompson's desk, catching the doctor's attention. "I think you know why I'm here," Thomas said, his voice steady but firm. "I've done my research, and I have proof that you've treated other patients just like you treated my son." Dr. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I don't know what you're talking about," the doctor said, his voice dismissive. "Jake's condition wasn't serious. I gave him the appropriate care." Thomas took a deep breath, trying to remain in control. "It's not just about Jake. It's about all the other patients who have been ignored or mistreated by you. You've been negligent, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." Dr. Thompson stared at him, clearly taken aback. "I've never mistreated anyone. I'm one of the top doctors here," he said, his voice rising a little. "If you have a complaint, you can take it up with the hospital board, but I don't have time for these accusations." But Thomas was ready for this. He pointed to the documents on the desk. "I have proof, Dr. Thompson. I know about the lawsuit, and I know about the investigations that were closed without action. You've been allowed to get away with this for too long." The doctor's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. "You think you can ruin my career with a few papers? You're wasting your time." "I'm not here to ruin you," Thomas said calmly. "I'm here to make sure no one else has to suffer because of your carelessness." The silence between them grew heavy. Thomas didn't expect the doctor to admit his mistakes, but he could tell that his words had struck a chord. Dr. Thompson wasn't as untouchable as he had once seemed. "I'll be going to the hospital board," Thomas said, standing up, "and I'll make sure the public knows the truth. You won't be able to hide from this." Dr. Thompson didn't respond, but his face told a different story. It was clear that the confrontation had left him rattled. As Thomas walked out of the office, he felt a small sense of victory. He wasn't done yet, but the doctor's reaction told him that the battle had only just begun. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Thomas. After his confrontation with Dr. Thompson, he immediately took action. He contacted the hospital board, arranging a formal meeting to present his findings. The lawyer he had reached out to helped him prepare the necessary documents, and they worked together to build a case that would hold Dr. Thompson accountable. Thomas wasn't just trying to clear his name or his son's name. He wanted to ensure that this kind of behavior would no longer be tolerated. At the same time, Thomas knew the risk. Going after such a well-respected doctor, someone with years of experience, would not be easy. There would be resistance, and Dr. Thompson would likely fight back. But Thomas had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. He had already seen what had happened to other patients, and he couldn't let that continue. The hospital board was scheduled to meet, and when the day arrived, Thomas arrived early, carrying the pile of documents and evidence. His hands trembled slightly, but his resolve was unwavering. This was a crucial moment. He had to make sure they understood the gravity of the situation. As he entered the boardroom, the serious expressions of the board members met him. They were professionals, well-established individuals who held the power to make decisions that could change Dr. Thompson's career. But as they listened to Thomas lay out the facts, it became clear that they weren't expecting such an accusation. Thomas spoke calmly but firmly, explaining everything he had discovered about Dr. Thompson's previous cases. He presented the lawsuit settlement and the hidden investigation details, pointing out how they had been covered up. As he spoke, the board members exchanged looks, clearly shocked by the revelations. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Thomas?" one of the board members asked after a long pause. "I'm suggesting that Dr. Thompson's actions have been a pattern," Thomas replied. "It's not just about what happened to my son. It's about the many others who have been ignored or mistreated. It's time to take action." The room grew quiet as the board members took in the information. They had heard complaints about Dr. Thompson before, but this was different. Thomas wasn't just making accusations. He had proof. And the fact that Dr. Thompson had been allowed to continue working despite previous complaints made the situation even more alarming. After what felt like an eternity, the board members began to speak. "We take these matters very seriously," one of them said. "We will launch a full investigation into Dr. Thompson's practices, and we will ensure that all necessary actions are taken." Thomas exhaled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. His persistence had paid off. While the road ahead wasn't guaranteed, the board had promised to look into the situation thoroughly. As he left the meeting, Thomas felt both exhausted and hopeful. He had taken on a respected doctor and had made his voice heard. Now it was in the hands of the hospital board. But for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt like they were on the path to justice. It wasn't just about his son anymore. It was about the truth being exposed, no matter how difficult it was. The days following Thomas's meeting with the hospital board were filled with uncertainty. He had done everything he could to bring Dr. Thompson's actions to light, and now it was in the hands of the hospital. But Thomas knew that the board's decision would not just affect the doctor's career. It could change the way people viewed the hospital and the doctors within it. The public would soon find out what had happened, and Thomas had to wonder, would they support him, or would they side with the well-known doctor? It didn't take long for word to spread. News of the hospital investigation into Dr. Thompson's conduct was picked up by local news outlets. Some media outlets reported that the doctor was facing scrutiny for allegedly ignoring patients' concerns, while others mentioned that an investigation had been launched based on new evidence. The story quickly gained attention. What had once seemed like an isolated incident was now part of a larger discussion about patient care and the responsibility of medical professionals. At first, the public reaction was mixed. Many people supported Thomas, praising him for standing up against a powerful figure. They called him brave for going after a respected doctor, someone who had been working in the community for years. People shared their own stories of how they felt unheard by doctors, and many began to question whether their experiences had been dismissed for similar reasons. But not everyone agreed. Some people defended Dr. Thompson, saying that he had been a trusted doctor for years. They argued that one or two complaints shouldn't overshadow his entire career. There were even a few who accused Thomas of exaggerating the situation or trying to ruin the doctor's life over one incident. Some of the messages on social media were harsh, suggesting that Thomas was simply looking for attention. Despite the mixed reactions, Thomas remained focused on his goal. The truth was on his side. He knew that no matter what people said, he had done the right thing. He had exposed a doctor who had put his own biases above the well-being of his patients, and no matter how difficult it was, Thomas would keep fighting for justice. The hospital board worked quickly. They launched a full investigation into Dr. Thompson's practices, contacting patients who had seen him in the past and reviewing his medical records. It didn't take long for them to find that Thomas had been right. There were numerous complaints about Dr. Thompson's behavior over the years, many of which had been ignored or hidden by the hospital. It became clear that Dr. Thompson's actions were not isolated, and the hospital had failed to address them properly. As the investigation continued, Thomas felt a sense of relief. He knew that justice would be served. The hospital announced that they were suspending Dr. Thompson pending the outcome of the investigation. They also promised to review their policies to ensure that patients were treated fairly and without discrimination. While Thomas was relieved that Dr. Thompson's actions were being acknowledged, he also knew the battle wasn't over. There were still people who would question his motives, still people who would defend the doctor. But in his heart, Thomas knew that he had done everything he could for his son and for all the other patients who had been ignored. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. After weeks of tension, the investigation into Dr. Thompson's actions finally came to a close. The hospital's decision was clear. Dr. Thompson was no longer fit to practice medicine at their facility. His medical license was suspended, and he was required to undergo additional training before he could return to any clinical work. The news hit the community hard. Many people who had trusted Dr. Thompson for years were shocked by the outcome, while others, like Thomas, felt a sense of justice. For Thomas, it wasn't just about seeing Dr. Thompson punished. It was about ensuring that other families would never have to face the same treatment. He knew that if Dr. Thompson had been allowed to continue practicing without facing consequences, more patients would have been affected. The fight had been hard, but it had been worth it. Jake was now on his way to recovery, thanks to the right treatment and care. Still, the aftermath of the whole ordeal left a mix of emotions. Some of the public continued to support Dr. Thompson, but there were many who thanked Thomas for his courage in speaking out. He had given people a voice, especially those who had felt silenced by a doctor or a system that wasn't listening. For the first time, people began to talk openly about how important it was for doctors to treat every patient with respect, no matter their background or circumstances. The hospital also promised to improve its systems and policies. They pledged to do more to ensure that patients were treated with dignity, and that complaints about any doctor or staff member would be taken seriously. It was a small step toward change, but a step nonetheless. Thomas didn't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but he was glad that something positive had come out of the whole situation. As for Jake, he was getting stronger each day. The medicine the new doctor had prescribed was working, and Jake was slowly regaining his energy. It was still a long road to full recovery, but Thomas was relieved to see his son smiling and playing again. The worry that had been weighing on his chest for so long had finally started to lift. Thomas knew that there would always be challenges ahead. There would always be people who disagreed with him or thought he had gone too far. But in his heart, he knew he had done the right thing. He had stood up for his son, for all the other patients who had been mistreated, and for the idea that everyone deserved to be heard and treated with respect. Now, with Dr. Thompson's future uncertain, and the hospital beginning to change its ways, Thomas felt a sense of closure. The fight wasn't easy, and it wasn't over, but he had won an important battle. And in the end, that was all that mattered.